Welcome, everyone. I'm President Mantella, and it's just wonderful to have you with us this evening. I'd like to welcome you to our first ever Presidential Roundtable series on the Constitution, elections, and democracy. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of three of my predecessors, past presidents, presidents emeritus, that have joined me here tonight, and just to thank each one of them. And I will go in the order of succession. So I'll start with Don Lubbers, the builder in many ways of Grand Valley State University, 32 years as our president. Don, do you want to wave at everybody and say hello? Well, Don is there. I can see him. So I'm going to add to past President Mark Murray, who's also joined us. And thank you, Mark, for being with us. And President Emeritus Tom Haas, who has joined us, and my immediate past predecessor. So great to have you all here and see you all again. Glad you're all healthy and well, and we're taking this on together. So you'll hear from each of my wonderful predecessors and good colleagues as we go through the session. This session was catalyzed by the January 6th storming of our Capitol, but also because of the struggle and pain that we had and remains in our community and community nationwide around engaging in difference and across different points of view and civil discourse. It brings me back to a quote of one of our favorite sons and one of our sponsors, the Ford Foundation, of past President Gerald Ford, who said during his presidency, "This is an hour that troubles our mind and hurts our heart." It captures the moment today as well. We wanted to, we talk together and we speak often, the leaders of Grand Valley State University, about what is the best thing to do in this moment in time for our university. And we came back to our foundation. And to us, that's coming back to the foundation of our democracy and the three topic areas we've outlined for this presidential series. But we also thought it was an important and symbolic message to do this together, to show a community whose leadership over time has remained engaged, supports one another, thinks about and works to the kind of orderly succession that is so important in leading enterprises that are intergenerational and that are meant to support our society and our community. So I'm just so pleased that we could all do this. And the way we've structured this is that one of my predecessors will sort of take a lead role in each one of the sessions. And today it's President Thomas Haas. So with that, let me thank Tom and turn it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Mantella. And to my colleagues, Mark and Don, thank you for joining as well. I have the privilege of introducing our guest and our speaker. Jeffrey Rosen is President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Constitution Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate the public about the U.S. Constitution. Located steps from Independence Hall in historic Philadelphia, it's a real model. The center engages millions of citizens as an interactive museum, national town hall, and a provider of nonpartisan resources for civic education. Mr. Rosen became president and CEO in 2013 and has developed the center's acclaimed Interactive Constitution, which brings together top conservative and liberal legal scholars in America to discuss areas of agreement and disagreement about every clause of the U.S. Constitution. The online resource has received more than 40 million hits since launching in 2015. Mr. Rosen is also a professor at the George Washington University Law School and contributing editor to The Atlantic. He's a highly regarded journalist whose essays and commentaries have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, on National Public Radio, in the New Republic, where he was the legal affairs editor, and the New Yorker, where he was a staff writer. The Chicago Tribune named him one of the 10 best magazine journalists in America, and is a reviewer for the reviewer for the Los Angeles Times called him, quote, the nation's most widely read and influential legal commentator. Mr. Rosen is the author of 6 books, including most recently Conversations with RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on the life, love, liberty, and law. He is also the co-editor of Constitution 3.0, Freedom and Technological Change. Mr. Rosen is a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and the Yale Law School. Please welcome Mr. Jeff Rosen back to GVSU in West Michigan. Jeff, good to have you here, sir.
Thank you so much, President Haas. It is wonderful to be with you and with President Mantella and with President Lubbers and President Murray. And it's wonderful to be back, even virtually, at Grand Rapids. I was so honored to join you on Constitution Day 2019 to talk about the future of the Constitution. And it's extremely meaningful to reconvene during this historic time in 2021 to think again about the future of the Constitution in light of the events of January 6th. I'd like to approach our topic in the spirit that all National Constitution Center conversations are framed with, and that is in a nonpartisan spirit. Let's separate our political from our constitutional views, and let us reason together, as Justice Louis Brandeis said, about whether or not the Constitution worked in light of the remarkable events of January 6th, and how we can strengthen its guardrails moving forward. I think I'll begin by invoking President Ford, who was such a great citizen of Grand Rapids and of the United States. And when he took office in August 1974, President... Unstable internet. Are you having trouble hearing me? Shall I continue?
We're hearing you fine, I think. I think you're doing just fine.
Oh, good. Sorry, I heard the words unstable internet. I'll continue. It's always the technological challenge, but we will forge ahead. So President Ford, when he took office in August 1974, said, "Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here the people rule." And friends, despite the remarkable challenge that it confronted on January 6th, our Constitution did work. The institutions held. Congress fulfilled its duty to certify the election. The judiciary repeatedly and nearly unanimously rejected efforts to overturn the election, and ultimately the peaceful transfer of power, which is the core of American democracy, proceeded. But there's no question that the Constitution faced one of the most severe tests in our history, because it was fear of mobs incited by demagogues that incited the framers to draft a constitution in May 1787. The framers came to Philadelphia to draft a constitution in order to create a government strong enough to avoid what they perceived as the ongoing dangers posed by mobs, like Shays' Rebellion, which was a rebellion of farmers in Western Massachusetts, debtors who didn't want to pay their creditors. James Madison spent the summer before the convention reading a trunk full of books that Jefferson had sent over from Paris about the failed democracies of Greece and Rome. And Madison concluded that all opportunities for direct democracy ran the risk of mob rule. In all very numerous assemblies of whatever characters composed, he wrote in Federalist 55, "Passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob." So that distinction between reason and passion between citizens governed by the cool voice of reason and those inflamed by demagogues to become violent mobs was central to the founders' concern. 40 years later, in 1837, a young Abraham Lincoln had the same warning about mob violence. He said, unless Americans could govern themselves by reason rather than passion, the Constitution would fall to demagogues and violent mobs. And that's his speech on the perpetuation of our political institutions delivered to the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield. There, Lincoln is responding to mob violence, including a racist murder in St. Louis and the lynching of the abolitionist newspaper editor, Elijah Lovejoy. And in his speech, which denounced mobocracy and mentioned the word mob 8 times, Lincoln blamed the violence on the followers of the populist Andrew Jackson, who is known as King Mob. And he said the only way for Americans to ensure the support of the Constitution remain the political religion of the nation would be to reaffirm their commitment to restraining irrational passions and hatreds with the cool voice of reason. Passion has helped us, he said, but can do so no more. It will in the future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. This distinction between reason and passion, I've been increasingly struck the more I read, was central to the framers' understanding of virtue and the pursuit of happiness. When Thomas Jefferson wrote about the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, he had in mind not feeling good, but being good. Happiness is the aim of life. Virtue is the foundation of happiness, Jefferson wrote, quoting Epicurus. And Franklin and Adams and Jefferson all took this distinction between reason and passion from Plato and Aristotle, who divided the soul into 3 parts: reason, desire, and passion. For them, the word passion meant emotions. That's our modern word. And the definition of classical virtue was using our powers of reason to moderate or govern our unreasonable or selfish desires and emotions, such as hatred, ambition, and envy, so we could achieve the classical virtues, temperance and prudence, all of which the framers thought were necessary to pursue our long-term well-being and the public good. So think of it as a kind of classical version of the marshmallow test. You have to resist immediate gratification and pleasure to obtain lasting virtue and to serve the public good. So it was the whole purpose of the Constitution to slow down deliberation so that citizens, rather than being governed by our hasty and irrational and immediate passions, could be governed by the cool voice of reason. And that's why the framers put in mind a whole bunch of cooling mechanisms to allow individuals to make thoughtful decisions based on their long-term aggregate interests of the whole community, rather than the short-term impulses of an inflamed mob or faction. And that's why Madison defined factions in Federalist 10 as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. I know that was a mouthful, but it's crucial to realize that this is the central evil the Constitution is designed to avoid. It could be a majority or a minority, and it's a group of citizens animated by selfish passion or selfish interests rather than public reason or the aggregate interests of the whole community. Now, this is what informed the framers' distinction between violent mobs and virtuous crowds. It's an interesting historical distinction, but we need to note that the Boston Tea Party itself during the Revolution was an example of crowd activity. The crowd gathered, it was inflamed by leaders like the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams. They go onto the ships of the British merchants because they believe the tea tax that Britain wants to impose is unconstitutional. They dump the tea in the harbor so that it can't arrive in Boston and triggering the tax. But when they break the locks on the ship in order to get the tea, they reimburse the captain for the broken locks, but not for the tea. That's how careful they are to attend to the private property interests of the company and the captain, which they respect, as opposed to the tea, which they think is unconstitutionally taxed. So it was not a violent mob. It was a carefully regulated crowd, which took seriously the distinctions between constitutional and unconstitutional actions. And that distinction is what informed all of the cooling mechanisms that the framers were trying to ensure. The separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, bicameralism within Congress are supposed to refine and enlarge the public views so that majority rule can become just rule rather than mob rule. Madison is confident that the large size of America will be our greatest protection against violent mobs, because he thinks by the time that a crowd gathers, if it's irrational and likely to commit violence, either they won't be able to find each other because the country's so big that organizing is really difficult, or by the time they do find each other, passion will cool and everyone will go home. And in the meantime, the leadership class will have an opportunity to deliberate with citizens, persuading them to focus on questions involving the common good rather than the partisan passions of the moment. So that's the first cooling mechanism Madison is pointing to, the large size of America. The second is the principle of representation. He thinks because virtuous leaders will be guided by long-term interests rather than short-term partisan passions, they can engage in this reasoned dialogue with citizens so that reason rather than passion will prevail. All right, does this sound a little idealistic post-January 6th? Of course, we all know the many technological and institutional and political changes that have undermined this vision of a virtuous group of enlightened representatives and journalists who Madison called the literati, who are reasoning thoughtfully with citizens using media technology like the broadside newspaper where the Federalist Papers were printed, so that the cool voice of reason can prevail. And without discussing all of the many challenges to this vision, let's just focus on the most obvious and immediate one and the most relevant in light of January 6th, and that's social media. It's clear that posts based on emotion travel further and faster on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube than those based on calming reason. The existence of social media has totally undermined all the stickiness of large geography. Madison's faith that everyone would get tired before they could organize is obviously not applicable in a world of Twitter and Facebook, where people can find each other instantly and organize quickly around the most inflamed and extreme positions rather than the most thoughtful ones. And we also know the important role of social media in allowing the mob on January 6th to organize. The mob action was planned on social media, and it was help gather people to Washington and plan their action, and resulted in the framers' nightmare. And I think that we can say that's a historical fact, that mobs incited by people who were arguing them to take violent action to commit illegal acts is exactly what the framers are trying to avoid. Now, what is to be done? I've got about, 6 minutes left in this talk, so I'm not going to solve this most urgent question of our time, but you have asked me to talk about the future of the Constitution. So let me discuss a few possible avenues of reform for strengthening these democratic guardrails, and then we'll look forward to a discussion. And I do want to frame things by saying, as I did it at the beginning, the Constitution did hold. I mean, there were several opportunities for it to fail, and it didn't. So that despite the grave challenges we face, in particular focusing on the social media aspect to it, we can be grateful for this, the institutions created by the Constitution, which allowed the peaceful transfer of power to take place. But there's no doubt that we face a very serious challenge that the framers in Madison would have had to confront. The thing I want to begin by saying is that this is not if the challenge is online radicalization, then it is not one that is limited to those with less educational opportunities, which may be the tendency of some elites to assume. The New York Times recently ran a fascinating article about a woman who became radicalized on YouTube and became a QAnon follower. And as it happened, she was a high school and college classmate of mine. I was privileged to go to a private school in New York City and then to to Harvard University, and she had a great education, and she was a very sort of thoughtful, rather progressive person. But it was the experience of seeing on YouTube suggested videos. It was the algorithm that sent her down the QAnon rabbit hole, according to the New York Times story. A video about British yogi psychics led her to something more extreme, and pretty soon she was enjoying the affirmation she was getting from the likes of the QAnon folks who got her into the filter bubble from which she has not emerged. So that suggests that part of the problem and part of the solution could be algorithmic. In other words, Facebook and YouTube could be more mindful about what they recommend based on your previous watching habits, and not recommend increasingly extreme versions of what you've already seen. And indeed, Facebook and Google are experimenting with precisely this kind of tweak to the system in light of recent events. Beyond that, there is a large and vigorous debate about whether or not speech should be restricted online to prevent radicalization. And this is too large a question for us to resolve tonight, except I want to share my views that I do not believe that content regulation is the solution. I think that the glory of the American constitutional tradition is the First Amendment principle, which protects speech more vigorously than any other nation in the world. And in America, we learned during the impeachment hearings, because it was the central legal test, speech, even speech advocating violence, is protected under the First Amendment unless it's intended to and likely to incite imminent violence or lawless action. Intended to and likely to incite imminent violence. That's an extraordinarily difficult test to meet. We heard during the debates over the impeachment trial that had President Trump been charged in a criminal case with illegally inciting violence, it would be a close case. There are arguments on both sides about whether his speech was directed or intended to producing a violent assault on the Capitol, and also whether the speech was likely to do so, and whether the violence was imminent. You could argue it either way. I think that's the greatest strength of American democracy, that we allow even advocacy of illegal activity, because we're so committed to the principle that, as Justice Holmes said, the best response to evil counsels is good ones. Debate must be robust, wide open, and free, and that the best test of truth is its ability to get itself accepted in the marketplace of ideas, or to use the equally inspiring but more civic Republican vision of Justice Louis Brandeis. Those who won our revolution believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. They thought that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them, discovery affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest threat to freedom is inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. There, I've more or less got it. That's from Whitney versus California, 1927. You can read that amazing concurrence after our talk tonight. And it is such an inspiring affirmation of faith in civil dialogue, which President Mantella began by reminding us this is the reason we're all convened here, is because of the urgent necessity of reasoning together, even if we may disagree about ultimate political ends, learning how to disagree without being disagreeable, so that we can cultivate our faculties of reason and be governed by reason rather than passion. So that, I hope, ties together my thoughts on the beginning of the framers' concern that we be governed by passion rather than reason, by mob violence rather than deliberation, and their belief that the best way to ensure the rule of reason was to allow completely uninhibited exchange of
really good
discussion, so that people are able to respectfully listen to those with whom they disagree and make up their own minds. Friends, these are anxious times when the principle of free and open debate is under grievous assault from all sides of the political spectrum, and there are tremendous pressures on the platforms, Facebook and Twitter and Google, to engage in vigorous content regulation to protect us from the speech we hate, as Justice Holmes called it. And these pressures are coming from users themselves, so they're very hard to resist because these are private companies that are responsible to their user base. But I guess I'll just end my thoughts right now by saying I urge you to resist those claims. And the way to do that is to read the primary sources. Don't take my word for it. I just did that little Brandeis riff from memory because I've done it enough times, but I want you to go to the primary sources. Read Whitney versus California in 1927. Read Justice Holmes's dissenting opinion in the Schenck and Abrams case. Read Madison's memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments, or Madison and Jefferson in the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution. And read the works of the second founders, of Frederick Douglass's defense of free speech in Boston, and of Prince Hall, the little known but African-American abolitionist who made such an impassioned plea for the importance of free speech. Remember that Frederick Douglass said, "Teach a man to read and you make him free." It is urgently important that each of you educate yourself about these principles by reading from the primary sources over the entire range of American history so that you can make up your own mind. And then we will come together and you'll be able to reason with your fellow citizens, pointing to the text themselves and being always inspired by the light of reason. Friends, I'm thrilled to share that the National Constitution Center is in the process of launching a new initiative to add to our interactive constitution, which President Haas mentioned, all of these primary sources so that you can go to read the sources I just read about. You click on the First Amendment and you'll find all of these great documents of liberty, as well as the leading Supreme Court opinions, as well as the great material that's already there, so that citizens around the country and around the world can make up their own minds. It is an honor to be engaged in this common enterprise of civic dialogue with each of you, but it's also a duty that each of us has. That's a kind of stern word, but I'm going to remind you and all of us of our civic duty to cultivate our faculties of reason, to take the time to educate yourselves, just as you're doing now, by reading the primary sources so that you can be informed and make up your own minds. And I know that you're going to do that because that's what you do here at the Harnstein Center and in all of your great events. And I know that that's what we're going to do in the discussion that follows. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jeffrey. We appreciate your comments very, very much. And I'm going to turn it to Tom Haas to ask the first question.
Thank you, President Mantella. And also, Mr. Rosen, that was a phenomenal challenge to all of us to put this at the center stage. Get to know what those sources are too. So thank you for that challenge for us as educators and us as students as well, and learners in this whole space. My question is, I read your essay, What If We Wrote the Constitution Today? And I think it follows on with your comments. After 234 years, what would it look like, and would it stand up to the current Constitution? Would it be more relevant or not?
Thank you very much, President Haas, for noticing that piece. That was a summary of a really exciting project the Constitution Center sponsored called the Constitution Drafting Initiative. And we commissioned 3 teams of really distinguished conservative, libertarian, and progressive scholars. And their homework assignment was, imagine you were writing the Constitution from scratch. What would it look like? So they kind of huddled 3 teams of 3 scholars each. And after a couple of months, they came back and they produced their constitutions. And the results really surprised us. The first thing that surprised us was that all 3 teams decided essentially to reform the current Constitution rather than to start from scratch. Even the progressive team acknowledged in their introduction that people sometimes think of us as wanting to scrap the whole thing, but far from it. We want to build on the existing system. In addition, what else surprised us? there were remarkable areas of agreements among the three teams who hadn't talked to each other after all. They're just proposing their reforms, on their own. Both the progressive and the conservative teams proposed to replace the Electoral College with a national popular vote, with ranked choice voting. And both proposed term limits for Supreme Court justices. And the libertarians were not averse to either reform. They just read their mandate as sticking to the current text. And there were other important areas of disagreement, of course, as well. Broadly, the progressives emphasized democracy and equality. The conservatives, deliberation of the kind of Madisonian kind that I've been discussing, and the libertarians, unsurprisingly, liberty. But they're just, I have to say, I hope everyone will just Google Constitution Drafting Project and you'll find it at the National Constitution Center. Read the three constitutions and the executive summaries of each of them. It was for me an extremely inspiring affirmation of the fact that we do agree far more on first principles than we know. We have so few opportunities today to affirm our common commitment to the text of the Constitution and the principles on which it rests. But these three teams just operating literally in a state of nature or in a mini constitutional convention ended up all affirming the broad ideals of the Declaration of Independence and of the Constitution in ways that make me optimistic moving forward.
Well, Jeff, I joined Tom in saying that was a terrific presentation. It was I'm sure you've done it before, but what a review of how we got to where we are in the founders' principles and the structure of the Constitution, and that the institution held. So that was a wonderful thing. I'd like to, you've got a real record now at the National Constitution Center of bringing conservatives and progressives together to engage in civil dialogue, the things we're talking about. Well, many of the viewers here have a role in some institution themselves, whether it's here at Grand Valley State University, the Howenstein Center, the Ford Museum, civic organizations like the Economic Club and others. Are there any fundamental principles you would offer us about how we can ensure that we in our own domains build up and honor this sense of civil dialogue at depth, where we really get to the issues, but we do it civilly? How do you do it so successfully at the National Constitution Center?
Thank you for asking. Thanks for mentioning all the great institutions that you just did. Because of the wonderful leadership of the National Constitution Center, both Doug DeVos and Hank Meyer are such great members of our board. I feel like Grand Rapids is a second home, and I'm just love to think with you about ways that you in Grand Rapids can promote this kind of civil dialogue. Here's how we do it at the Constitution Center, and it was not intuitive, and we developed this. We sort of scaled it up, but there are a couple principles or rules for debate. First, I begin by doing what I did with all of you by saying, let's separate our political from our constitutional views, asking not what we think the government should do, but what the Constitution allows or forbids it to do. That's a law professor's move. I'm a law professor, as you know. I teach at GW Law School. That's the way I always began my constitutional law classes. Now it's the way we begin all of our debates. And it's counterintuitive, because if you haven't gone to law school, you need a little bit of thinking about what does it mean to have a constitutional rather than a political view. And then I can give an example, like saying the question isn't, is gun control a good or bad idea, but does the Second Amendment allow or prohibit it? And that opens up the possibility that you might reach a political conclusion that diverges from your constitutional one. You might think gun control is an excellent idea, but the Constitution forbids it, or the opposite, that it's a terrible idea, but the Constitution allows it. So that's the first way of just slowing down deliberation. People can't just say, I feel this, and state their partisan passions. They've got to stop and think and realize there might be a difference between their immediate passion and their constitutional conclusion. Second, you have to learn before you can have an informed opinion on a constitutional question, which means listening to arguments on both sides. And that's why it's so important that we generally convene people of different perspectives, conservative and progressive, and invite them to have a civil dialogue, which models the discussion and allows people to listen before they make up their own mind. And the third component is the one that I really emphasized at the end, has increasingly impressed me as crucial. And that's focusing on the primary sources. Really, we know what a polarized time this is. And when people, legal scholars or historians or citizens express their opinions about history of the Constitution, then they may be quite heated. But if you're just dealing with the text themselves, then that focuses the discussion on those texts. So I quoted Brandeis, and we could parse each line together and ask ourselves what he meant and whether he was right. And the same for any Supreme Court opinion, and the same for those great Frederick Douglass speeches and so forth. So that's why and it's also incredibly empowering to have the primary sources. And it almost feels like if I can use the word in its best sense, a radical act to put up those primary sources, but it's also one that's radically possible because of the net. And it's so exciting to me that even 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been possible to put free and online all of these magnificent sources to inspire people and to create so much light and learning, but now we can do it. So that's the way we've done it. I understand that not every discussion that you have in Grand Rapids you may not want to have a constitutional dimension. You might want to talk about policy issues, historical ones. But I'd suggest a version of that. And actually, I'd love to think with you about what a model for a non-constitutional discussion would be. But it would have the same elements of basically asking people to step back, to separate their immediate opinions or feelings or passions from their conclusions based on reason, and then to have both perspectives or all perspectives represented, and then to model a civil dialogue.
Thank you, Jeff. President Lubbers?
I'd like to ask you to make some predictions and put you on the spot a little. The Electoral College, rather ironic that the Electoral College did produce a minority president that was not exactly the kind of a person that our founding fathers predicted that electors would select. Do you think that we will continue with the Electoral College, or do you think the proposals to change it and just go to majority vote will succeed? Second question or prediction, is the Fourth Amendment adequate to deal with citizens' privacy rights in today's technological society?
Wow. Well, thank you for asking two of the hardest, but also most important constitutional questions out there. But the predictive question is not hard. And before I give you my clear answer, I'll just share with the group what I mentioned to all of you before the talk started, which is that my last pre-COVID in-person gathering was at the Grand Rapids Economics Club, and it was a debate on the Electoral College. It was convened by the National Constitution Center, and it was Jesse Wegman, who's just written a good book. He's at the New York Times, called Why We Should Abolish the Electoral College, and James Caesar from the University of Virginia, who gave the best defense of the Electoral College that I've heard. It was a marvelous debate. And if it's online, check it out. And we podcasted it, so you can find it at the Constitution Center. Will the Electoral College be eliminated? No, I don't think it will, because it's very hard to pass a constitutional amendment. And to pass one, you need it to be proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and then ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, or proposed by a convention called on applications of 2/3 of the states and ratified by the legislatures, or by conventions specially held in 3/4 of the states. And given the perception, which may or may not be accurate, that the Electoral College has been favoring Republicans, I think it's not accurate, because we know that the election of 2004 might have gone to John Kerry as the loser of the popular vote, but the winner of the electoral vote if a handful of votes had shifted in Ohio, less than 70,000. And that's why in this debate, it was really interesting. I learned, the Grand Rapids Economic Club debate, that the Electoral College was within a hair's breadth of being eliminated by constitutional amendment in 1969 or so, 70, an amendment proposed by the late Senator Birch Baugh endorsed by President Nixon, by all the former Republican and Democratic presidents, and passed the House and came within a whisker of passing the Senate, but was blocked by a bunch of Southern Democratic segregationists who thought that the Electoral College increased the power of the South. And that was, though, a time when people realized that there's no particular reason the college should favor one party or another. Now that it's perceived to favor red states, the way the Senate's constructed makes it unlikely that an amendment would be proposed and the state legislatures would be unlikely to ratify it. So that's my prediction. And I notice I didn't tell you what I think should happen, but I don't think it is going to happen. The Fourth Amendment and digital privacy is a great question. And here my hero is Brandeis, and there's too much to say. Let's see. You could really get me going on this, but broadly, I think the challenge is one that the Supreme Court is confronting in some nearly unanimous opinions. The broad question is, can the government subpoena all of your cell phone records and reconstruct your movements 24/7 for a month? And that was the case that called Carpenter that the Supreme Court recently confronted. And in a sense, all 9 justices had previously held that the government could not reconstruct your movements for a month by putting a global positioning system device on the bottom of your car and tracking you. That was the Jones case. But they disagreed about whether or not you needed a physical trespass to trigger the Fourth Amendment. And this is the tricky part. 5 justices, led by Chief Justice Roberts, said, we have an expectation of privacy in the whole of our movements. You can learn so much about someone if you track them 24/7 that it's an unreasonable search of it violates our expectations of privacy. That's what Chief Justice Roberts said. The dissenters said, you need a physical trespass because the framers thought that the general warrants that sparked the American Revolution were unconstitutional because they broke into people's homes and searched through their private desk drawers. And here they had to trespass on the guy's driveway and put the device on the bottom of his car. That doesn't solve the cell phone problem because there you can get the records without physical trespass. But in the Carpenter case, I know I'm going into the weeds here, but this is the nub of the answer to your question. Once again, I think it was 5 justices with Roberts and the liberals said, yes, you have an expectation of privacy in your movement, so you don't need a physical trespass. Some of the justices said no trespass, no search. And Justice Gorsuch said there might have been a property rights violation because the terms of service of the cell phone company were violated when they turned over the records. I think if you insist on physical trespass, you're not going to have as much privacy as the framers took for granted in the 18th century, because there will be situations where the contract isn't violated and you're still tracking someone's movement 24/7. Imagine just flying a drone over someone's head and tracking them 24/7. There'd be no physical trespass, but it would be a Chernobyl of privacy violation. So what's the solution? I've come to think, I asked students this, I think we asked our Constitution drafting team, and the libertarians just wanted to tweak the words to make clear that digital privacy is protected. And this wasn't exactly their tweak, but I would just suggest humbly or modestly a tweak like this: the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers is what it says, and effects. That's the current word. Why not say persons, houses, papers, and digital effects or something like that? Or some other non-dated word, because of course there'll be something that could be non-digital that will implicate the same interests moving forward. That's always the problem of constitutional change. But you don't have to get too fancy here. There's no doubt, no question, as Chief Justice Roberts said in his unanimous opinion, involving the search of cell phones of someone who was arrested. And the question is, can you look at the cell phone when you're patting them down? And the government said, yeah, because generally when you arrest someone, you can pat them down and open up any closed container like a cigarette packet to make sure it doesn't have weapons. And a cell phone is like a cigarette packet. And the chief and all 9 justices, a cell phone isn't like a cigarette packet. It contains our entire lives, our thoughts, our diaries, the records of everywhere we've been. It's such an invasion that you need a higher standard of cause before you can open up the cell phone. And he cited the general warrants that sparked the American Revolution. Remember, I talked about the Boston Tea Party and how that orderly crowd was reimbursing the captain for the locks. Well, that was a protest against the kind of instruments that allowed the government to search through our private effects. Then they were papers kept in locked ships or homes, but now they're kept in the digital cloud. So it's not a big translation. You can be a constitutional originalist like Justice Gorsuch or Justice Scalia and still want to translate the amendment so it protects just as much privacy in the 21st century as in the 18th. And I don't think you have to tweak the words all that much, but that's just me. And however, I do, if we were in person, I would take a digital vote of hands. And I am confident that if I were to ask this group, do you believe that it would be an unconstitutional violation of your person's houses, papers, or digital effects for the government to put a drone over you and track you 24/7 per month? I'm confident almost everyone would say yes. So I hope the court eventually will too.
So I'm going to apologize first to the crowd because there are a number of questions already, and I'm going to pick through a couple that are perhaps a bit different than what you've spoken to thus far. So one question is how you use the Constitution in legal arguments when there is, because so much of it is up to interpretation. So how do you, since people interpret it differently, how do you use it in an argument is the question.
It's a wonderful question. It's precisely because it's open to interpretation that you use it in an argument by beginning by stating the arguments on both sides. And that's the thrilling enterprise of the interactive Constitution. Gosh, I'll resist the urge to screen share, but please check it out after we finish. You can click on any amendment and find the top liberal and conservative scholars nominated by the Conservative Federalist Society and the Progressive American Constitution Society with 1,000 words about what they agree the provision means, and then separate 1,000-word statements about what they disagree about. So I would begin any constitutional argument that way, by just reading the common statement, what do people agree about? And there is always some area of core agreement, and it's often surprising that it's more than you think. And then by signaling the areas of disagreement, and then just have a fair discussion where you just take some time. Everyone gets to speak in turn. You don't yell at each other and interrupt each other. And you know, if you do it in the kind of law professor style, the way you heard the way I was trying to respond to the excellent questions of the presidents, the Fourth Amendment question, and that's a hard case. You have to kind of run through the arguments on both sides a bit. The Electoral colleges too, although I didn't really fully do that. So the bottom line is that I find it very difficult in talking about most constitutional questions to confidently say the clear answer is this or that, because you can generally say that there are decent arguments on both sides. But it's a habit of conversation and dialogue, and you need a certain humility to have it. So, but that doesn't mean that it's radically indeterminate. And it also doesn't mean, and I really want to urge this on you too, I do not believe that the Constitution is just a political fiat by partisan judges. I don't think that's true. If you look at I'm not denying the strong disagreements on the current Supreme Court, or the fact that the court has, is at the center of politics. I'm not urging you to be naive, but there are many significant cases. I just gave you one of them where all 9 justices are agreeing about digital privacy or agreeing about the result and disagreeing about the means. And similarly for many, many other areas where you'd be quite surprised about the unexpected alignments. And Chief Justice Roberts has done a magnificent job at trying to persuade citizens that the justices are more than politicians in robes, and are having these sort of dialogues. So don't assume it's all politics. Don't just assume the answer is clear. Have the humility to learn before you have an informed opinion, and then you can make up your own minds.
Wonderful. Let me ask you 2 questions and a single question, because in some ways they're similar. It's how do we heal, or how do we navigate the growing tension if those who supported President Trump are portrayed as racist or extremists, or if just to engage in the critical conversation with more radicalized or violent blowback is really at the beginning of the conversation. So how to engage when there is so much, to go back to what you shared with us, passion, emotion within the context of even the beginning of the conversation.
I mean, it's a very serious problem. Of course, you can't have a respectful dialogue where people are told that they can't participate because they're racist or bigots. You know, or on the other side, that they can't participate because they support violence, or they want to, you know, destroy American institutions or whatever. That's not a constructive way to talk. So, you know, that's why that's why our discussions together about how to structure conversations that avoid that setup are so important. The platforms are important. Making sure that the topics are really important too. And you know, the truth is, there's some questions that we're just not going to agree about. I don't think it's productive to bring together Trump and Biden voters to say whether President Trump was good or bad, or Biden too. I mean, we're not going to convince each other about politics, and we shouldn't try to. But we can perhaps convince each other, or at least have open minds and learn something when we talk about things that we don't already have strong passions about. So I think that's a framing. But I respect the question very much, because it is not constructive for anyone to feel like their perspective is not legitimate, and you know, is beyond the pale. Everyone is worthy of equal concern and respect. We are all created equal and endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we should be treated as such in any debate.
Thank you. I want to go to Fred Ansek's question, which is, what can be done to make the Constitution and democratic values a compelling value?
Well, I think that we all saw on January 6th the urgent, compelling need to adhere to the values of the Constitution. There could be no more dramatic example of dangers of deviating from its shining commands. I mean, I could say more, but you know, and just to kind of reaffirm the fact that most people seem to understand that. It's just one metric, but it's a stark one. Traffic to the Constitution Center website was off the charts, both before, leading up to, and after the election. We're getting 500,000 hits a day to explainers on the Electoral College, for example. The previous record had been like 100,000. Those are serious numbers. And if you Google the Constitution now, the interactive Constitution is coming up first for most amendments. And the Constitution Center, as a result, is now the third most visited museum website in America. It had been much lower before all this started. So people are hungry for information about the Constitution. They're just Googling away. We also know what people are Googling, which is creepy from a privacy perspective, but very useful if you're a website entrepreneur or a nonprofit. And you know, when the Electoral College is in the news, people Google that and the Second Amendment, and also more surprising things like the separation of powers or structural principles as well. So I think we all understand very well why the Constitution is important. And if there's any silver lining for this challenging time, that would be one of them.
Thank you. I'm going to ask our three presidents to each give a 1-minute reflection on Jeffrey's talk and anything you'd like to each add. So Don, President Lubbers, I'd love to start with you, and then President Murray and President Haas.
In 7th grade, my classmates and I were taught the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the workings and responsibilities of the 3 divisions of federal government, the importance of separation of powers and some state government. We came away with girls and boys understanding, but it was enough. I fear that education, so necessary for democracy, is being neglected in too many schools. The second important aspect of a democracy, if it is to survive for 500 generations, is civil discourse. We must compromise our disagreements, find enough common ground to make a democratic society work. We cannot have a preponderance of demonizing opponents, demeaning, telling preposterous lies. It is as if courtesy is a weakness. Courtesy and civil discussion must dominate if democracy is to survive. I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very compelling.
Please let me say here, here. That was beautifully stated. Thank you.
Here, yeah.
Here, here.
President Murray.
Well, I'll just say I've got another degree of hope tonight. I think, Jeffrey, what you laid out today is really good. It shows that if we use some of those virtues of temperance and prudence and humility, we can get back to reason. And when we get back to reason, we can really engage more civilly. And it's great to see what the Constitution Center is doing in that regard, and some lessons that we and all of our institutions can take from that. But what you closed on was the additional lift of hope, which is in the face of this crisis, hundreds of thousands, and I presume you add that up over weeks, millions of people in this country went to you to look, which says there's goodness, there's hope, there's aspiration for doing the right thing in so many of us in this country. And I hope we can keep building on that. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for that. So glad you found it optimistic, cause for optimism, and I share it. Thank you for that.
President Haas. I think you're on mute, Tom.
Okay. Thank you, President Mantella. In 1969, on the 4th of July, I was sworn into the Coast Guard, raising my hand and swearing allegiance to the flag and supporting and protecting the Constitution of the United States. On the 6th of January, I was very emotional seeing what was happening there, and it took a toll that night, not getting much sleep, wondering what had happened. And then as I started listening to others around our table with family members, and as an educator, you really resonated with me in terms of our civic responsibility that we have to our nation. We have a great nation, and it's all about service. And that's what we have within the context of Grand Valley State University as well. But we have that civic responsibility to one another, as Don was pointing out, and also with regards to ensuring that we communicate properly with due respect as well. But I want to say thank you so much, Jeff, for being here again in your second home. And I want to really say again to Dr. Mantella, thank you for convening the three presidents that now look to you as the hope for our Grand Valley State University as we move ahead into our future. But I think that this particular session led by Jeff and others really points to our mission, that it's solid and we need to respect the nation as we see it under the Constitution of the United States. So thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you, President Haas, for inspiring the conversation between all of you, all of us. It was a real catalyst to this forum being created. And Jeffrey, I think that you brought us to the source. You lifted our hope. You urged us to inquiry. And as President Lubbers said, you urged us, Don, to reflect as educators on our obligation. Wow, that's a pretty powerful 1-hour session. And so we're just so deeply grateful to you, Jeffrey, and to each of my predecessors for what you each brought to the table in the conversation. I tried to keep my comments limited tonight so that I could hear from all of you, and I am just so grateful to each of you for bringing so much to this forum. I do want to take just a moment before we close to thank our sponsors, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Brooke College Center for Interdisciplinary, the Padnos Civil Discourse, the Myers Honors College, the Office of Student Life, the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, and the Hauenstein Center. And I'd like Brent to come on for just a minute. Brent Holmes, our acting director, to first of all thank him and acknowledge him and the staff that supported us tonight, but also to make mention and reminder of the upcoming 2 sessions.
Thank you, President Mantella, past Presidents Haas, Murray, and Lubbers. We are honored to have kicked off the Presidential Roundtable series this evening with Mr. Rosen and look forward to the engaging speakers that will be joining us in the coming months. Please join Grand Valley State University, the Hauenstein Center, and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation in March as we focus the conversation on elections, and then again in April to focus on democracy. Please ensure to watch your mail and email for announcements about these engaging conversations. Thanks again and have a great evening.
Thank you all.